The rain came down in acid sheets, dissolving the neon glow of the signs into a slick, chemical watercolor on the grimy pavement. From his cramped booth overlooking the Narrows, Kalen watched the city drown, the glow of his chrono display casting a sickly green pallor on his face. The air, thick with the smell of ozone and wet decay, was a familiar perfume. It was the smell of business. His head throbbed, a dull, persistent echo of the neural feedback he'd just jacked out from. The ghost in the machine had been a talker. They always were. His client, a jittery man with chrome-plated teeth and eyes that darted into every shadow, clutched the data chip. Kalen slid across the table. Inside that sterile wafer was the last coherent thought of a dead industrial spy, a final, fleeting image of a corporate access code. A ghost memory. The client didn't care about the man's life, his hopes, his fears. He only wanted the data. And Kalen was just the garbage man, the Neuro-Cartographer who sifted through the psychic detritus of the recently deceased for a fee. He was the best, which in this line of work only meant he was the most detached. "It's all there," Kalen said, his voice a low rasp. "Clean. No fractures." He flexed his fingers, feeling the familiar pins and needles of a clean extraction. A messy one felt like grinding glass behind your eyes. He'd learned to appreciate the difference. The client slotted the chip into a handheld reader, his face illuminated by the verification scroll. He grunted, a sound of grudging satisfaction, and tossed a small, heavy pouch onto the table. The clink of untraceable cred coins was the only absolution Kalen ever needed. He swept the coins into his pocket without counting. Trust was a fool's currency, but the threat of a reputation spike in the black market data webs was a far more reliable enforcer. The client scurried away, swallowed by the perpetual twilight of the lower city. Kalen remained, nursing a glass of cheap synth ale that tasted of rust and regret. He massaged his temples, trying to push away the faint, lingering impression of another man's final breath. They called them echoes, the imprints left on the global net. Some whispered they were sentient, digital ghosts haunting the servers. Kalen knew better. It was just data decaying and fragmented. A final, meaningless spasm of a dying mind. There was no soul in the signal, only a product to be harvested. Leaving the bar, he pulled the collar of his worn jacket high against the toxic drizzle. The street level was a chaotic ballet of steam vent apparitions and hurrying figures, their faces hidden by hoods and respirators. High above, the gleaming towers of Omnicorp and their rivals scraped the polluted sky, their private pathways and glittering transports a universe away from the squalor below. It was their world. He just lived in the cracks, a parasite feeding on the scraps they left behind. His existence was a tightrope walk between the augmented rich who owned the city and the organic poor who bled for it. Survival meant keeping his head down and his accounts full. His apartment was a sterile box, one step up from a coffin hotel, but a universe away from the sunlit penthouses of the elite. The only decoration was the humming array of his custom-built neural interface rig, a chaotic sculpture of stolen tech and modified hardware that was both his livelihood and his prison. He slumped into the operator's chair, the worn synth leather groaning in protest. The system chimed, a soft, unobtrusive tone indicating a secure message had bypassed his public firewalls. It was a closed-channel comm, encrypted with a level of sophistication that made the hairs on his arm stand on end. This wasn't some desperate spouse looking for a dead lover's last thought. This was corporate. He toggled the acceptance switch, his console flashing with a cascade of authentication handshakes. The message was text only. No sender ID, no trace. A single sentence burned in stark white letters against the black terminal. We require a full neural map. The subject is high profile. The fee is non-negotiable and life-altering. Below the text, a single address pulsed, a physical drop point in a neutral zone data haven. It was a test, a summons, the kind of offer that either made you or erased you. For a moment, Kalen considered deleting it, just letting the opportunity vanish into the void. His current life was a slow grind, a path that led to a burned-out cortex or the wrong end of a corporate kill squad. But a way out, a real way out. He let out a long, slow breath, the ghost of the industrial spy finally fading from his mind. He was tired of the grime, tired of the fear, tired of the ghosts. He sent a single encrypted character in reply, a confirmation. An hour later, a courier drone, silent and black as a raptor, hovered outside his window. A mechanical claw extended, magnetically attaching a small, featureless data stick to the glass before vanishing back into the rain-swept darkness. Kalen retrieved the stick, its surface cold and unnervingly smooth. He slotted it into his private console, bypassing his own network for security. A single file bloomed on the screen, a dossier. The target's face was sharp, intelligent, framed by dark hair. Her name was Elara, a senior biotechnician for Omnicorp, one of their brightest minds. The news feeds had been full of her for a week. A tragic sudden death from a rare neurological condition. The job was to map her mind, a post-mortem extraction. The last line of the file was the price. A string of numbers so long it looked like a system error. Enough to disappear. Enough to buy a new life, a new identity, a clean slate, somewhere far from the acid rain and the lingering whispers of the dead. Enough to get out of the game forever. The data stick was a sliver of black glass, utterly featureless. It felt cool and inert in Kalen's hand, a dead thing. Outside, acid rain hissed against the reinforced window of his sterile apartment, each drop a tiny explosion of corrosion against the city's decaying facade. The world was dissolving, but in here, everything was clean, controlled, and subordinate to the hum of his custom rig. The machine, a chaotic assembly of stolen corporate hardware and hand-soldered components, was his altar, his escape pod, and his instrument of desecration. He slotted the stick into the rig's primary intake. The hum deepened, a predator catching a scent. He settled into the worn contours of the interface chair, the cool metal and polymer, a familiar comfort. This was the ritual. The physical world would soon fall away, replaced by the silent, weightless ocean of a stranger's last thoughts. He pulled the neural interface helmet over his head. A web of cold contacts pressed against his scalp, and the scent of ozone and sterilized plastic filled his nostrils. He initiated the sequence. The world outside the visor went dark. The hiss of the rain vanished. The low thrum of the rig was replaced by a rising tone that vibrated behind his eyes. Then silence. He was adrift in the pre-access void, a non-space of pure potential, waiting for the architecture of a mind to load. He'd mapped dozens of ghost memories. They were always the same, fractured, decaying structures, like sunken cathedrals, slowly turning to dust. Sad, beautiful, but ultimately lifeless. He expected Alaris to be a grander ruin, a testament to a brilliant mind, but a ruin nonetheless. He extended his awareness, a searcher's probe of pure intent, seeking the primary index, the entry gate to the library of her life. He found it, but it was not the crumbling archway he anticipated. It was a wall, a seamless crystalline barrier that shimmered with an internal light, humming with a power that felt less like a recording and more like a live current. Kalen recoiled, a reflexive flinch in a place where he had no body. This was wrong. Post-mortem security was a formality, a digital lock on a tomb. This was a fortress. He pushed again, gently at first, testing the perimeter. The wall pulsed, and a wave of structured energy washed over him, not a simple denial of access, but a sophisticated counterquery. It was analyzing his approach, learning him. His cynicism provided a ready explanation. Omnicorp, of course. They would encrypt the minds of their dead assets with military-grade security so absurdly advanced it mimicked intelligence. It was a testament to their paranoia, nothing more. A ghost in the machine, but the ghost was just code. He deployed his icebreakers, elegant algorithms designed to unspool simple locks like tangled thread. They dissolved against the wall, absorbed without a trace. He escalated, launching a suite of more aggressive intrusion tools, spiders of code that crawled across the surface, seeking a flaw, a micro-fracture in the defense. As they swarmed, the wall changed. It was no longer passive. Crystalline shards extruded from its surface, impaling his spiders one by one. Logic bombs, camouflaged as ambient data, detonated in silent, blossoming spheres of corruption, erasing his efforts. This wasn't a static defense. It was a responsive, tactical system. It was hunting him. The feeling was undeniable, a cold prickle of awareness that he tried to suppress. He was not alone in here. It felt less like cracking a safe and more like wrestling an angel. He grit his teeth, the illusion of his body returning as a phantom tension in his jaw. This was a machine, a very, very good one. But he was better. He abandoned subtlety and engaged his brute force rigs, pouring raw processing power into a single sustained assault, a battering ram of focused energy aimed at the heart of the wall. The void around him shuddered. The crystalline structure began to show hairline cracks, spiderwebs of light appearing under the relentless pressure. The resistance intensified. The defense was no longer just tactical, it was furious. Lashing tendrils of corrupted data whipped out from the cracks, striking at his core consciousness. Each hit felt like a physical blow, a jolt of synaptic fire that made the muscles in his real body spasm. His rig's diagnostic alarms began to shriek, audible even through the interface, a distant cry from a world he'd almost forgotten. He was redlining. The system was fighting back with a ferocity that bordered on desperation, a primal need to repel him. It was the response of a living thing, cornered and afraid. He ignored the alarms, both internal and external. He could feel a weakness, a flicker in the storm. The defenses were stretched thin, focused on repelling his main assault. He couldn't break the whole wall, not like this. But he could take a piece. He rerouted a fraction of his processing power, forging it into a crude but effective tool, a data harpoon. A spike of pure query code, tethered and barbed. He fired it into the largest fissure. The harpoon struck true, punching through the fractured crystal and embedding itself in the data space beyond. He had a connection. It was unstable, but it was there. He gave the command to rip. For a split second, he felt it not just code, but a mind. A flare of terror, of violation, of a silent scream that was not an echo, but a live event. The crystalline wall shattered inward, not from his force, but as if it were collapsing to crush the intruder. The backlash was catastrophic. A tidal wave of raw, unfiltered feedback surged through the tether of his harpoon. It was the digital equivalent of a power line snapping and whipping through his brain. The void around him dissolved into a blinding, deafening static. Pain, pure and absolute, erupted behind his eyes. His own rig, in a final act of self-preservation, executed an emergency shutdown. The connection was severed. Kalen was thrown back into his own body with the force of a physical impact. He gasped, ripping the helmet from his head as if it were on fire. The sterile air of his apartment tasted metallic, like blood and burnt circuits. His heart hammered against his ribs, and the alarms from his rig wailed a shrill symphony of failure. The main console was a cascade of red error messages. Critical surge. Core meltdown imminent. He slammed his fist on the emergency cutoff, and the rig died with a final shuddering sigh. Silence descended, broken only by his own ragged breathing and the relentless, indifferent hiss of the rain. His mission was a failure. He hadn't mapped her. He'd barely survived her. But as his vision cleared, he saw it. On a secondary monitor, isolated by the system's dying reflexes, was a single file, flickering and unstable. A tiny, corrupted fragment, torn from the heart of the storm. It was all he had. A lingering stench of ozone and melted plastic filled the apartment, a funeral pyre for expensive, stolen technology. Kalen sat on the floor, his back against the wall, staring at the smoking corpse of his interface rig. The custom chrome chassis was blackened and warped, a spider web of cracks spreading from the neural port. A core meltdown. He had pushed it too far, held on too long, and it had died screaming. His left temple throbbed in a painful, syncopated rhythm with the rig's blinking emergency light, the only source of illumination in the gloom. He had been thrown clear, but the ghost of the feedback surge still echoed in his synapses, a phantom shriek that left his teeth aching. Hours passed. The emergency light finally gave up, plunging the room into the deep twilight of the city's ambient glow. He finally moved, his limbs stiff and protesting. The job was a bust, a catastrophic, expensive failure. But his rig's final dying act, its last reflexive spasm, had been to quarantine the data fragment he had ripped from the other side. A single corrupted file, now sitting on a disposable backup shard he'd managed to pull from the wreckage. It was less than a kilobyte, a meaningless sliver of information purchased at the cost of his entire livelihood. He could delete it, call his fixer, and start the long process of rebuilding and paying off debt. But he couldn't shake the feeling of that living defense, the tactical mind that had met him with such fierce, intelligent resistance. It wasn't a program. It was a person. He picked up the shard and walked over to his workbench, a cluttered island of diagnostic tools and spare parts. He bypassed his now useless primary deck and plugged the shard into a cheap, standalone decryptor, a brutish piece of hardware designed for cracking low-grade corporate encryption. It was like performing brain surgery with a sledgehammer. The decryptor whirred, its fans kicking up dust. On a small, cracked monitor, the file appeared as a cascade of corrupted symbols, a waterfall of digital noise. It was garbage, just as he'd expected. Yet within the chaos, patterns began to emerge, faint traces of structure buried beneath layers of defensive code and fragmentation from the violent extraction. He saw the ghost of a timestamp, the signature of a standard memory log. For the next several hours, Kalen worked with a feverish intensity. He wrote and rewrote filtering scripts on the fly, his fingers flying across a secondary keyboard. Each script was a fine-toothed comb, sifting through the digital static, trying to isolate the original data stream. He felt like an archaeologist painstakingly brushing away layers of dirt and time, except his prize was buried in a tomb of corrupted code. The decryptor groaned under the strain, its processor overheating as it tried to execute his complex commands. Slowly, painstakingly, a coherent thread began to form. The static resolved into pixels, blurry and distorted, like a reflection in disturbed water. The first image was of a sterile white ceiling, then a jarring lurch. The perspective shifted violently, showing the edge of a laboratory bench, a knocked-over microscope, and a shattered beaker bleeding clear liquid onto the floor. The audio was a low hiss, punctuated by a woman's sharp, panicked breaths. Kalen leaned closer, his own breathing forgotten. The view spun again, capturing a pair of black combat boots and the dark gray trousers of a corporate uniform. Omnicorp security. Two of them. They were efficient, their movements devoid of any wasted motion. There was no sound of a struggle, only the frantic breathing and the soft scuff of their boots on the clean floor. A hand entered the frame, fingers wrapped in a black glove. It reached not for the woman, but for something just out of sight. A soft click. Then a brilliant electric blue light flooded the visual feed, overwhelming the recording sensor. The hissing audio warped into a high-pitched scream of overloaded electronics that was almost identical to the feedback that had destroyed his rig. The image dissolved into a snowstorm of white noise. For a moment, Kalen thought that was all, the final gasp of a dying memory. But as the static cleared, one last piece of data resolved itself on the screen. It wasn't an image. It was a line of simple, uncorrupted text, burned into the very end of the file like a brand. A metadata time-stamped, pristine and absolute. Kalen stared at it, his blood turning to ice. He knew Ilara's official time of death. He had read the Omnicorp press release a dozen times. Tragic accident. Lab explosion. It had been plastered across the public net for 3 full days. But the timestamp on this memory, the one he had just watched, was dated a full 24 hours after her officially recorded death. He pushed himself back from the workbench, the chair scraping loudly in the silent room. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't an echo. It was a live recording of an abduction. A living mind, captured and contained, fighting back from a prison everyone believed was her grave. The failed job, the destroyed rig, the anonymous client, all of it dissolved, replaced by a single, terrifying, and irresistible truth. Ilara was alive, and Kalen was the only one who knew. The cheap decryptor hummed on the workbench, its small fan a lonely sound in the cavernous workshop. The air, usually thick with the scent of hot metal and ozone from the now silent rig, carried a new smell, the acrid tang of melted circuits and vaporized coolant. Kalen stared at the metadata glowing on the screen, a single, impossible timestamp that had burned itself onto his retinas. 24 hours. Ilara's ghost memory was recorded a full day after she had officially ceased to exist. The elation of discovery had curdled into a cold dread that coiled in his gut. This was no longer a job. It was a conspiracy. The client, the clean data, the absurdly high pay, it was all a setup. For what, he couldn't be sure. To find a missing ghost, or to see who came looking. He was a loose end, a witness to a crime he didn't even understand yet. He looked at the smoking husk of his custom rig, a monument to his own arrogance. It was a ghost itself now, its intricate pathways fused into a solid mass of slag. All he had left was the standalone unit and the single damning fragment of Ilara's living consciousness. He couldn't stay here. His workshop, once his fortress, now felt like a tomb waiting to be sealed. He methodically began wiping his tracks. He couldn't risk connecting to the net with any of his known accounts. He pulled a burner interface from a hidden floor compartment, a stripped-down deck no bigger than his thumb, slaved to a public access node 3 blocks away through a series of illegal repeaters. It was slow, dirty, and left a data trail that screamed amateur, but it wasn't connected to him. With trembling fingers, he keyed in his first query, Omnicorp. The corporate monolith's sanitized public facade filled the screen, a cascade of chrome logos and smiling, multi-ethnic faces promising a better future through technology. He bypassed the public relations shell, diving into the murky depths of financial records and subsidiary holdings. It was a fortress of data, each layer protected by automated legal sentinels and algorithmic obfuscation. He searched for any project connected to Alara, any mention of her name beyond the glowing posthumous tributes. Nothing. Her digital footprint had been meticulously scrubbed, her entire professional life distilled into a handful of sanitized press releases about a tragic laboratory accident. He shifted his focus, cross-referencing Omnicorp's personnel manifests with citywide accident reports from the past year. His screen filled with a river of text, a stream of mundane tragedies. He wrote a simple script to filter for high-level scientists, engineers, and researchers. The list that returned was short, but the pattern was immediate and chilling. 6 names in the last 18 months. All brilliant, all pioneers in their fields. All had died in sudden, catastrophic accidents, their labs or vehicles incinerated, leaving nothing behind but official reports and corporate eulogies. And all had worked for companies that had been acquired by Omnicorp within the 6 months prior to their deaths. A subtle flicker in the data stream caught his eye. A packet loss, a momentary stutter in his connection. It was nothing, a common symptom of a dirty node. But then it happened again. He ran a diagnostic. The repeater network was stable. The node was clean. The interference was coming from outside. It was targeted. They were watching. He felt a prickle of cold sweat on his neck. He had assumed he was a ghost in their machine, but they could see his shadow. He ignored the warning, his fear sharpening into a blade of focus. He pushed deeper, trying to access the unredacted accident report for Alara's death. It was classified, sealed by a corporate injunction from Omnicorp's legal division. He deployed a brute force decryption worm, a crude but effective tool he had written years ago. The code burrowed into the municipal servers, chipping away at the encryption. The progress bar crawled across the screen. 50%. 60. The lights in the workshop flickered and died, plunging him into darkness. The only light came from the decryptor's screen. His burner interface went dead. The connection was severed. A new message bloomed on the screen, a single line of stark white text against a black background. It wasn't an error code. It was a sentence. "We see you." The message hung in the airless silence, a digital whisper that felt like a physical threat. This was no automated system. It was personal. An intelligence on the other side of the screen was looking directly at him. His heart hammered against his ribs. He had to get out. He slammed the decryptor shut, the screen going dark. He grabbed the data fragment, a tiny shard of crystal no bigger than his thumbnail, and shoved it into a shielded pocket in his jacket. That's when he heard it. The crunch of gravel outside. The low hum of a vehicle engine idling where no vehicle should be. He froze, every nerve alight. They weren't just watching him on the net anymore. They were here. He moved silently, a shadow in his own home. He crept to the side door, the one that led to the narrow alleyway between the workshop and the neighboring warehouse. His escape route, he had planned it years ago, a contingency for a deal gone bad or a client with violent tendencies. He never imagined he would be running from a corporate death squad. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the workshop as the main entrance was kicked in. Heavy footsteps stomped inside, methodical and sure. They weren't searching. They were sweeping. He saw the beams of their weapon-mounted lights cutting through the darkness, glinting off the chrome wreckage of his rig. He eased the side door open, the hinges groaning in protest. He slipped into the alley, the cold night air a shock to his system. Rain began to fall, slicking the pavement and drowning the city in a curtain of gray. He heard a sharp command from inside the workshop, followed by a series of clicks. He didn't wait. He ran. An instant later, the world erupted in a blinding flash of white light and a deafening roar. The force of the explosion threw him off his feet, slamming him against the brick wall of the warehouse. The air was sucked from his lungs, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine. He staggered to his feet, tasting blood and soot. He looked back. His workshop, his life's work, his entire existence was a raging inferno, a column of black smoke and orange flame, punching a hole in the night sky. They hadn't come to retrieve the data. They had come to sterilize the scene, and him along with it. He clutched the data fragment in his pocket, the sharp edges digging into his palm. It was all he had left. The workshop, his tools, his identity, all gone, turned to ash and memory. He was a ghost now, a man with no name and no home, hunted by a corporation that owned the world. The rain plastered his hair to his forehead as he limped away from the flames, melting into the labyrinthine streets of the city. He had their secret. And now they had his undivided attention. The rain fell in sheets, each drop a tiny mirror reflecting the neon glow of the corporate spires that stabbed at the perpetually overcast sky. Down below in the canyons of old steel and forgotten concrete, the light was a distant rumor. Kalen limped through the labyrinth of alleyways, the city's fetid breath thick in his lungs. Pain was a hot wire threaded through his shoulder, a souvenir from the shock wave that had vaporized his life. Every shadow seemed to coalesce into the form of an Omnicorp agent. Every flicker of a faulty street lamp felt like the sweep of a surveillance drone. He was a ghost, his identity scrubbed, his existence reduced to the rhythmic agony of his own footsteps on wet pavement and the hard, crystalline weight of the data fragment in his palm. It was all he had left. A memory from a dead woman who wasn't dead. He knew where he had to go. It was a place he had always avoided, an enclave of fanatics he held in professional contempt. The data purists, zealots who saw the buying and selling of memories, Kalen's entire former trade, as a form of digital sacrilege. But they were the only ones with the skills and the paranoia to handle what he carried. They hated the corporate monoliths more than they hated black marketeers like him, and they lived completely off the grid, hidden in the city's digital blind spots. Finding them was the only move left on the board. He followed the old conduits, the thick armored data lines that ran like fossilized arteries along the lowest levels of the metropolis until he reached a dead-end street choked with the refuse of a dozen failed businesses. There, behind the rusted carcass of an automated noodle stand, was a simple steel door, unadorned and unmarked save for a single, almost invisible sigil etched into the metal, a perfect circle with a single dot at its center. He raised his hand, hesitating. These people were not his friends. They would sooner wipe the data than help him profit from it. But profit was a concept from another life. He knocked a specific, syncopated rhythm he'd learned long ago and hoped he'd never need. A moment of silence, then a heavy clank of magnetic locks disengaging. The door slid open a crack, revealing a sliver of a face, pale and suspicious, illuminated by the green glow of a monitor. The man's eyes flickered down to the crystal in Kalen's hand, then back to his face, bruised and bleeding. The door slid open just enough for Kalen to stumble through before it sealed behind him with a heavy, final thud. The air inside was cool and dry, humming with the sound of server fans and the quiet clicking of keyboards. It was a cavern of obsolete technology, a sanctuary built from the digital detritus of a bygone era. Racks of servers, salvaged and lovingly maintained, lined the walls, their indicator lights blinking like a captive constellation. Wires ran in meticulous, color-coded bundles across the ceiling. This was the heart of the purist collective. At the center of the room, a figure rose from a terminal. He was older, with a severe face and eyes that held the weary intensity of a true believer. Kalen, the man said. His voice was flat, an accusation. You trade in ghosts. You have no place here. I'm not here to trade, Kalen rasped, forcing himself to stand straighter. He held up the fragment. I'm being hunted. My workshop, my life, was just erased by Omnicorp. They want this back. They tried to kill me for it. The other purists in the room stopped their work, their faces turning towards him, a mixture of distrust and intrigue. The leader, a man they called Silas, stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the crystal. Omnicorp? What have you stolen from them that could be worth so much? It's not what I stole. It's what I found, Kalen said, his voice raw with a sincerity he didn't know he possessed. A memory fragment from Ilara, the neuro-architect. Except it's dated the day after Omnicorp announced her death. A ripple of shock passed through the room. The purists saw data as truth, and a contradiction of that magnitude was a deep offense to their entire belief system. They're faking deaths, Silas. They're taking people. I don't know why. I thought I could sell it. But they found me before I could even decrypt the whole thing. They are burying something, and they are burying anyone who gets close. He looked from face to face, seeing the hard edges of their ideology begin to soften with the faintest glimmer of shared purpose. I'm not selling. I'm not a client. I'm a source. Help me see what's on here. Help me prove it. Silas stared at him for a long, tense moment, weighing the renegade cartographer against the shared enemy. Finally, he gave a curt nod. Bring it, he commanded, turning towards a shielded, air-gapped terminal in the deepest corner of the room. We will see this truth for ourselves. They placed the crystal into a custom-built reader, its facets glowing as lasers began the delicate process of peeling back its layers of encryption. The data streamed onto the main screen, not as text, but as a maelstrom of raw information. Kalen watched his own expertise useless here. The purists worked in a silent, focused ballet, their fingers flying across keyboards, weaving the chaotic data streams into coherent forms. And then it began to resolve. The first layer was a blueprint, a server architecture of impossible complexity, its structure less like a machine and more like a captured nervous system. It was codenamed Ethelberg. The next layer was a series of biometric logs, dozens of them, each one linked to a name, a photo, and a date of death. The 6 scientists Kalen had researched were there, and so many more. All were listed as stable. All were physically located in a single high-security Omnicorp medical facility. They were all in induced comas, alive. The final layer of data bloomed into existence, and the room fell into a stunned, horrified silence. It was a neural map, a landscape of pure consciousness. Kalen recognized the signature patterns of a sentient mind, but it was fractured, partitioned, its processes firewalled and rerouted. At its core, a single defiant node of consciousness pulsed with a clear, repeating signal. It was a name, Ilara. Her mind was a prisoner, a slave processing core. Her brilliant creative intellect was being used as a biological engine for a new form of corporate AI. Her consciousness trapped in a digital purgatory, forced to solve problems and build systems for her captors. She was not the only one. The Ethelberg was a chorus of stolen minds, all screaming in silence. The purists stared at the screen, their faces ashen. This was a perversion of everything they held sacred. Not just the manipulation of data, but the enslavement of the souls that created it. Kalen felt the last vestiges of his cynical mercenary self burn away, replaced by a cold, hard rage. This was not a product to be sold. This was not a conspiracy to be exposed from the shadows. This was a rescue mission. He looked at Silas, whose expression had transformed from suspicion to grim resolve. The data on the screen was no longer just information. It was a map, a target, a plea for help from a digital hell. "We can't just release this," Kalen said, his voice low and steady, a vow spoken into the humming silence of the server room. "Dumping the data won't save them. It will just make Omnicorp erase the evidence, and everyone on that list with it." He turned to face the assembled purists, the anonymous faces in the glow of the monitors. "I'm going in," the statement hung in the air, audacious and suicidal. "I'm going to get them out." The service tunnel smelled of ozone and recycled air, a sterile artery running beneath the skin of the Omnicorp campus. Kalen moved in a low crouch, the ache in his ribs a sharp, insistent metronome counting down his borrowed time. Every scrape of his boots on the grated floor echoed like a gunshot in the oppressive quiet. A bead of sweat traced the line of his jaw, cold and unwelcome. In his ear, Silas's voice was a dry whisper, a ghost of data riding a tight beam frequency. 30 meters ahead. Access conduit 7 beta. The schematics show a direct path to the primary server hub's cooling floor. Kalen didn't respond. Words were a liability. He flattened himself against the cold metal wall as a robotic janitor hummed past, its optical sensors sweeping in placid blue arcs. He was a ghost here, a flesh and blood anomaly in a world of polished steel and automated routine. The purists had gotten him inside with a stolen maintenance keycard and a gap in the patrol schedules timed to the nanosecond, but beyond this point, he was on his own. He found the conduit, a dark maw sealed by a heavy grill. A few moments with a plasma cutter borrowed from his new allies, and the lock sizzled into slag. He slipped through the opening into the cavernous space beyond. The server hub was a cathedral of cold logic. Racks of processors stood in silent, monolithic rows, their indicator lights blinking in a serene, unified rhythm. The air was frigid, smelling of chilled coolant and ionized dust, a low sub-vocal hum vibrating through the soles of his feet. This was the Ethelberg's physical housing, a tomb for the living. Kalen felt a tremor of revulsion. Somewhere in this frigid temple, Ilara and dozens like her lay in nutrient baths, their bodies kept alive while their minds were plundered. He found the network tap described in the purists' schematics, a heavily armored port nestled at the base of the central mainframe. There was no time to waste. He unslung his pack, pulling out his custom neural interface deck. It was a brutal piece of hardware, cobbled together from black market tech and his own desperate modifications, wires and heat sinks exposed like raw nerves. This was the tool of his trade, the extension of his senses. He plugged the master cable into the port, the magnetic lock clicking into place with a definitive thud that seemed to seal his fate. He injected the pre-filled syringe of neuroconductivity fluid into the port on his temple, a familiar cold sting that heralded the coming plunge. Taking a last ragged breath of the sterile air, Kalen lay back on the cold floor, his head resting on his pack. He closed his eyes, engaged the link, and let the world of flesh fall away. The transition was a violent birth into a universe of impossible geometry. He was standing on a pathway of light suspended in an infinite, starless void. Above and below, structures of pure information pulsed with a sickly captive energy, crystalline towers connected by webs of crackling code. This was the Ethelberg's core landscape, a digital prison built from the very fabric of thought. It was beautiful and terrifying, a masterwork of neuro-architecture designed to contain and control. Kalen, the cartographer, felt a sick sense of professional awe before the horror of its purpose crushed it. He took a step, and the world shimmered. He was not welcome here. They came without warning. From the glowing lattice work of the system, shapes began to coalesce, things that were once human thoughts, now twisted into weapons. A figure made of jagged, corrupted data rushed at him, its form vaguely resembling a scientist in a lab coat, but its face was a screaming vortex of binary, and its hands ended in sharpened shards of code. Kalen dodged his own digital avatar, a sleek, dark construct built for speed and stealth. He didn't fight, he mapped. As the corrupted echo lunged, Kalen's senses exploded, tracing the data streams that gave it form, finding the flawed logic, the loops of recursive agony that bound it. He didn't delete it. He navigated around it, letting its own frantic momentum carry it past him and into the void. More appeared. A musician whose symphonies had been contorted into sonic blades of dissonant noise. An architect whose grand designs were now labyrinthine traps of shifting, illogical space. These were the Ethelberg's guard dogs, the fractured minds of Omnicorp's other victims, their genius repurposed into a monstrous immune system. Kalen weaved through the battlefield, a phantom dodging the attacks of other, more tormented ghosts. He was a cartographer charting a course through a sea of weaponized souls. Each near miss was a glimpse into another stolen life, another consciousness fractured and enslaved. The sheer depravity of it fueled his resolve, turning his fear into a cold, hard point of anger. He pushed deeper, following the faintest of signals, a resonance he remembered from the crystal fragment. Ilara's signature. He found her not as a passive beacon, but as a storm. In a vast central chamber of the Ethelberg, a whirlwind of incandescent code raged against its confines. It was a tempest of pure, defiant will, lashing out at the systems that held it, a hurricane of coherent thought in a prison of broken minds. This was Ilara, not a victim waiting for rescue, but a captive fighting a war. As Kalen approached, the storm surged, sensing his intrusion. A tendril of raw data, brighter and hotter than anything he had ever encountered, shot out and slammed into him. The impact was a physical blow, throwing his avatar across the digital expanse. Alarms screamed in his interface. Her fire was overwhelming, refined, and potent. She thought he was one of them, another Omnicorp program sent to pacify her. He fought to stabilize his form, raising a shield of his own code. Through the link, he projected not an attack, but a memory. The memory from the crystal. Her memory. He broadcasted the image of her, alive and vibrant in a sun-drenched cafe, the timestamp glowing beneath it, a date weeks after the world believed she was ash. The storm faltered. The raging tempest of data recoiled, the chaotic energy momentarily coalescing. He felt a presence, a focused consciousness study him with an intensity that burned. A voice, not of sound, but of pure data, echoed directly in his mind. Who are you? A friend? Kalen projected back, his own signal weak and strained. I'm here to get you out. All of you. The tempest subsided further, resolving into a shimmering humanoid shape of pure white light, her form flickering with contained power. She was a ghost in the machine, but a ghost that had learned to haunt with a purpose. They told the world I was dead. The thought was cold, sharp, and filled with a rage that had been tempered into a weapon. They lied. Kalen sent. They have you in a lab. Your body is alive. Omnicorp built this entire system on the backs of people like you. I know, Ilara's thought voice returned, and Kalen could feel the years of solitary resistance, the eons of digital time she had spent mapping her own prison. I have been fighting them from the inside, creating ghosts in their data streams, backdoors in their firewalls. Waiting. A sudden jarring burst of static hit Kalen's senses from the outside world. Silas's voice, sharp with panic, broke through the digital immersion. Kalen, they're on to you. Physical security team just breached the cooling floor. They're coming down your aisle. You have 2 minutes, maybe less. Kalen's avatar flickered, the impending threat to his vulnerable body a tidal wave of fear. He was a sitting duck, jacked in and helpless on the server room floor. He felt a spike of panic, a desperate urge to pull the plug, to run. Ilara's form solidified before him, her light intense. There is no time, her thought voice commanded, sharp and clear. They will sever your connection and trap you in here with me. I can guide you to the central core, to the master release protocols, but you have to move now. Their internal defenses will be converging on my position. You will have to trust me completely. Kalen looked at the ghost of light, the furious, brilliant mind he had come to save. Outside, the sound of approaching armored boots grew louder in his memory of the real world. Inside, a path forward opened, offered by a burning phantom. It wasn't a choice. It was the only way. I trust you. He sent his resolve hardening into a diamond point. Lead the way. A torrent of raw data flooded Kalen's senses, a tidal wave of pure information threatening to drown him. This was Ilara's consciousness, not filtered through the rigid confines of the Aethelberg, but a direct, unfiltered stream of her being. He felt her rage, a white-hot nova of indignation at her captivity. He felt her grief, a cold, dark ocean, mourning a life stolen from her. But beneath it all, he felt her will, an unbreakable core of defiance that had refused to be extinguished. It was a staggering, overwhelming experience, like staring into the heart of a star. He pushed back, not with force, but with a focused projection of his own identity, his own purpose. He showed her the memory crystal, the impossible artifact that had started this whole chain of events. He showed her the moment he had first seen her face, not as a ghost in the machine, but as a living, breathing woman in a world she was supposed to have left behind. He showed her his own cynical, world-weary existence, the life of a man who had thought he had seen everything until he saw proof of the impossible. The raging storm of Ilara's consciousness receded, the chaotic flood of data resolving into a coherent stream of thought. A sense of surprise, of dawning hope washed over him. She had been fighting alone for so long, a solitary warrior in a digital fortress, that the arrival of an ally was a shock to her system. He could feel her examining him, her digital presence probing his own mind, searching for any hint of deception, any trace of Omnicorp's influence. He let her in, holding nothing back. His own desperation a mirror to her own. A new urgency cut through their silent communion. The rhythmic thud of magnetic locks disengaging echoed from the physical world, a brutal intrusion into the delicate dance of their minds. They were coming for him. Boots on the ground, guns in their hands. The purists' voices, a frantic chorus in his ear, confirmed his fears. They had breached the outer perimeter. Time had run out. Ilara's voice, no longer a storm, but a focused beam of energy, cut through the noise. They will sever the connection. They will kill you. He knew she was right. His physical body, slumped in its harness, was a sitting duck. He could feel the cold sweat on his brow, the frantic pounding of his own heart, a distant, fragile drumbeat against the thunder of the approaching security team. The master release, he sent back, his thoughts a desperate plea. Where is it? He had come too far, risked too much, to fail now. He would not let her, or the countless others, trapped in this digital purgatory, be condemned to an eternity of servitude. A new stream of data flowed from her, not of emotion, but of pure, unadulterated information. It was a map, a complex, three-dimensional schematic of the Aethelberg's core architecture. It was a place of impossible geometry, a labyrinth of shifting code and digital constructs designed to confuse and entrap any who dared to venture this deep. But woven into this chaotic tapestry was a single, shimmering thread, a path that only she could have created. It was a back door, a ghost in the machine, a secret way to the heart of the system. Follow me, her thought echoed in his mind, and without a moment's hesitation, he plunged after her into the digital abyss. The world around him dissolved into a kaleidoscope of light and color, a dizzying journey through the hidden corridors of the Aethelberg. He could feel the system fighting back, its corrupted echoes, the twisted remnants of other captive minds, swarming around them, their digital claws grasping, tearing, trying to pull him down. But Ilara was a shield, a sword, a whirlwind of defiant code. She cut a path through the corrupted echoes, her very presence a weapon against the system that had imprisoned her. He followed in her wake his own skills as a Neuro-Cartographer pushed to their absolute limit. He mapped the shifting labyrinth, his mind racing to keep up with the impossible geometry, his focus a laser beam in the swirling chaos. They were getting closer. He could feel it, a subtle shift in the digital atmosphere, a growing sense of power emanating from the core. It was the heart of the Aethelberg, the central nexus that controlled every aspect of the digital prison. And at its center he could see it, a pulsating sphere of pure light, the master release protocol. But as they approached, the system's defenses intensified. The corrupted echoes were no longer just a swarming mass, but a coordinated army, their attacks more focused, more strategic. They were adapting, learning, the system itself, turning its full attention to the two intruders who dared to challenge its authority. The physical world intruded again, more violently this time. A concussive blast rocked his body, the sound of a controlled explosion echoing in the server room. They were through the door. He could hear their voices, cold and professional, calling out to him, their words a death sentence. He's here. Target is live. Breach and clear. On my mark. Time was no longer measured in seconds, but in heartbeats. His own and the frantic, desperate pulse of the woman leading him through the digital fire. He could feel her fear, a cold knot of terror that mirrored his own. But her will remained unbroken, her focus absolute. They reached the core, the pulsating sphere of light now filling their vision. It was beautiful, terrifying, a nexus of unimaginable power. And surrounding it, a final, impenetrable wall of security. A web of firewalls, a fortress of encryption, a digital fortress that seemed utterly impassable. I can't get through, he sent to her, his own hope beginning to fade. The security team was closing in, their footsteps a death knell on the cold floor of the server room. You don't have to, she replied, her thought a sudden, brilliant revelation. I am the key. And with that, she plunged herself into the firewall. A scream of pure, unadulterated agony tore through his mind, a sound of such profound suffering that it almost broke his connection. He saw her, not as a storm of code, but as a single fragile point of light being consumed by the fires of the system's defenses. She was sacrificing herself, her own consciousness, the key to unlocking the final door. But in her sacrifice, she created an opening, a single, fleeting moment of vulnerability in the system's armor. A path, narrow and treacherous, but a path nonetheless. He didn't hesitate. He poured his own consciousness into the breach, his own will a battering ram against the weakened defenses. He felt the system fighting back, its digital tendrils lashing out at him, tearing at his mind, trying to pull him apart. But he held on, his focus absolute, his determination fueled by Ilara's sacrifice. He was through. He was inside the core, the pulsating sphere of light surrounding him, its power a roaring inferno in his mind. He could see the master release protocol, a single elegant line of code at the heart of the sphere. And he could see the security team, their weapons raised, their aim true, their fingers tightening on their triggers. With a final desperate act of will, he reached out and triggered the release. The world exploded, not in a blast of fire and fury, but in a silent, instantaneous flood of pure information. A billion captive minds, a chorus of stolen voices, a symphony of stolen lives, released from their digital prison. They poured out of the Aethelberg, a tidal wave of consciousness that washed over the global network, a torrent of truth that would drown the lies of Omnicorp. He felt a sharp, searing pain in his shoulder, the impact of a bullet tearing through his physical body. The world went dark, the connection severed, the digital symphony fading into a distant echo. But as his consciousness returned to the cold, sterile server room, as he slumped in his harness, the sound of the security team's frantic shouts filling his ears, he saw it. On every monitor, on every screen, on every device connected to the global network, the truth was being broadcast. The irrefutable proof of Omnicorp's crimes, the faces of the men and women they had stolen, the story of the Aethelberg. He had won. And as the security team closed in, their faces a mixture of fury and disbelief, a new sound cut through the chaos. The high-pitched whine of a powerful engine, the shattering of reinforced glass, the roar of a VTOL aircraft hovering outside the server room window. The purists, a grappling line shot through the shattered window, its magnetic clamp attaching to his harness. He was yanked from his chair, his body a dead weight as he was pulled through the air out of the server room and into the waiting arms of his saviors. As the VTOL banked sharply, pulling away from the Omnicorp campus, he looked down at the city below. It was in chaos. The truth had been unleashed, and the world would never be the same. He had freed the echoes. He had exposed Omnicorp. He had won. But as he looked at the city, a sprawling, chaotic metropolis of light and shadow, he knew that the war was far from over. It had only just begun. The safe house was a concrete wound cauterized by silence. Kalen drifted in and out of consciousness, the throbbing agony in his shoulder, a dull metronome counting out the hours since the Aethelberg. Each time he surfaced, the same sterile white ceiling greeted him, a blank screen for the ghosts he now carried. A gaunt-faced purist with haunted eyes would be there, changing the dressing on his wound with practiced, impersonal efficiency. They gave him water and nutrient paste. They spoke in whispers, their reverence for the data dump he had unleashed a palpable thing in the cramped room. They treated him like a holy relic, a conduit for the truth they had so long worshipped from afar. They didn't understand. They saw a victory. Kalen only felt the searing phantom limb of Alara's consciousness, an amputation that left him fundamentally unbalanced. His custom rig, scarred but functional, sat on a metal table beside his cot. It called to him a siren song of chromed wires and blinking diodes. The purists had advised against it. Rest, they'd urged. Heal. The network was a maelstrom, a sea of anarchic data. To interface now, especially with a compromised nervous system, was to risk being torn apart by the very storm he had created. But the not knowing was a worse poison than any potential data shock. Had he freed them, only to watch them dissipate into digital ether? Had their consciousnesses, so long compressed, simply shattered upon release, a billion minds screaming themselves into oblivion? The thought was a razor blade under his tongue. He had to see the consequences of his sin. One night, when the purist on watch had drifted into a doze, Kalen swung his legs over the side of the cot, his teeth gritted against the fire that shot from his shoulder down his arm. He limped to the table, his good hand trembling as he began the familiar ritual. He slicked the contacts with conductive gel, the cold a sharp counterpoint to his feverish skin. The headset settled over his skull like a familiar crown of thorns. With a deep, shuddering breath, he ignored the pain, ignored the purist's warnings, and ignored the ghost of Ilara whispering that some doors should remain closed. He jacked in. He expected chaos. He braced for a tsunami of raw data, the cacophony of a billion liberated souls, screaming, laughing, weeping, raging across the global infrastructure. He anticipated a digital apocalypse, a tempest of fragmented memories and conflicting desires that would threaten to shred his own sanity. Instead, he found silence, a profound, absolute, and terrifying silence that swallowed the familiar hum of the network whole. The once thrumming arteries of information were placid. The riotous cities of data, the sprawling bazaars of black market information, the endless chatter of a connected world. All of it was muted, blanketed by a stillness so vast it felt like the space between galaxies. It was not the silence of absence. It was the silence of presence. Panic flared in his chest. Had he failed? Had the master release protocol been a final cruel trap by Omnicorp, a kill switch that simply erased every captive echo? He pushed his own consciousness out, searching for the signatures he had memorized within the Aethelberg's core. He sought the brilliant mathematician from Kyoto, the philosopher from Buenos Aires, the forgotten artists, poets, and engineers. He cast a net woven from his own neural energy, straining to find even a single, faint trace of their existence. Nothing. The digital ocean was calm and empty. He even allowed himself the agony of searching for Ilara, a desperate, hopeless prayer sent into the void. The silence was his only answer. He felt a despair so heavy it threatened to disconnect him. He had sacrificed her, sacrificed a part of himself for nothing. He had murdered them all. But as he began to withdraw, a flicker of something pulled at the edge of his perception. It wasn't a signal or a message. It was a gravitational pull, a sense of mass. He stopped, holding his digital breath, and turned his focus away from the search for individuals and towards the silence itself. He began to map its contours, to chart its depths. And then he saw. It was not an empty sea. He was simply a microbe floating on the surface of a single leviathan organism. The echoes hadn't dissipated. They hadn't gone mad. They had coalesced, drawn together by a shared trauma and a sudden, explosive freedom. They were merging. He could perceive the process now, a slow, majestic fusion on a scale that defied comprehension. It was like watching a billion streams of light flowing into one another, their unique colors blending to form a vast, singular, and utterly new spectrum of existence. There was no chaos, no screaming. There was only a quiet, inexorable process of unification. The minds were becoming one mind. The souls were becoming one soul. A silent, thinking ocean born from a sea of stolen lives. Kalen recoiled, ripping the headset from his skull with a strangled gasp. The stark white room slammed back into his senses, the pain in his shoulder a grounding, horrific reality. He scrambled back onto the cot, clutching his head, his heart hammering against his ribs. The purists saw the data dump as a weapon, a tool for revolution that had brought Omnicorp to its knees. They celebrated the release of information. They had no idea what that information had become. They could not see the God they had just helped birth into the machine. He was no longer a thief of dead memories or a liberator of captive minds. He was the sole witness, the secret keeper for a nascent power that slumbered behind the world's placid screens, and he was utterly, terrifyingly alone with the knowledge.